For those who don't know me, I'm Eric Sario. I'm Gene Kopsel's assistant. I joke a lot, but I work with Gene on innovations. We're part of the innovation team, and we are the champions for innovation in global health. But as you know, there's streams of applications and ideas moving to concepts in terms of innovations. And we tend to be very practically minded here towards our breakthroughs and results we want to achieve, our problems we want to solve in our respective areas of work. And, but as part of the kind of strategy for innovation, I think under a lot of influence from Gene and our collective brainstorm, has been to say, well, we need to also think about, you know, how do we develop a culture of innovation? How does innovation really happen? Because we don't always get the innovation we want right when we want it. So how do we advance things forward? And I'm very happy to introduce Don Ellison. And Don and I were colleagues at ICF. Don is a senior vice president at ICF. I was not a senior vice president at ICF, but we worked together. And Don is a demographer by training and has done all kinds of things. You can talk to him after the meeting, and you know, he's leading work in international health and programs at ICF and in business development and others. But I think he also moonlights in thinking about some big ideas, and has been writing and researching issues of innovation. And so that was kind of part of the fun of interacting together at ICF. So when we got started with this brown bag series, I shared some of Don's writings with Gene, who was as enthusiastic as I was. So we're very happy to have Don here today to speak about the social milieu. You always have to be suspicious of people who use French words or have a French accent, but in this case it's for a good cause. So you're going to talk to us about, you know, innovation, how they happen in the context where they happen. And so there'll be a presentation, and we obviously will have time for question and answers and discussions. And at Patrice's request, you know, Erin jumped in and is filming this, so we'll be able to share it with our country colleagues. So thanks everybody. And Don, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Let me tell you a little bit about how I ended up with the ideas I had and writing the things that I wrote. In 2001, I had the good fortune of getting onto a consortium that provided the Broadcasting Board of Governors with media surveys studies. Broadcasting Board of Governors is the U.S. agency that oversees Voice of America and Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, etc. And they had, at the time, a very robust research program. We became a part of that consortium, so I headed up the team that did the work in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. And just by chance, at the time, our company also had offices in East Asia doing mostly commercial market research. This gave me an opportunity. We were doing household surveys and focus groups in West, East Africa, and Central Africa, Southeast Asia. And it gave me a chance to travel and go into villages, go into people's homes, and anything from a small hut to a villa, sit and listen to focus groups about how people used media. And it was also a time in which digital technologies were just beginning to make their appearance in a lot of these places. Urban areas in Africa had, you know, internet cafes, hotels would have a business center. Internet was very slow. Used to spend an hour downloading 4 or 5 emails. That was the pace at which things went. Cell phone saturation, because we were doing media studies, I know all the numbers, but cell phone saturations were still like 5%, 6% at the time. But what was interesting about it was going into many, many different settings, and then also going up to Hong Kong and Shanghai and seeing how people were using technology. And I got very interested not in the technology per se, but how people were using it and what they were doing with it. And I would see parallel things happening 10,000 miles apart. How people were using cell phones, sharing cell phones in families, I love the example of the text me. So you're just about out of money, and you want to talk to a friend, so you text them and say, call me. All right, because the calls in were free, the calls out cost money. But I would see this in Cambodia, I'd see it in Vietnam, I'd see it in Nigeria, and of course, nobody told them to do this. They were figuring this out themselves, and people were solving problems, they were adapting and innovating. And so that got me into thinking about, how does all this work? How does this happen? And that got me into reading about a lot of different things, and one thing led to another. I won't go into the whole progression, but one thing led to another, and I ended up writing a paper. Actually, it was a chapter in a book that kind of failed, and I liked the chapter, so I kept working on it, and it got long, it got short. Eric read it, commented. I had a friend who teaches at Hopkins, and he circulated it. So anyway, finally, I think I got it at a point where it sort of makes sense to me. I'm not sure if it makes sense to anyone else, but it makes sense to me, and it's important for me that things make sense. So if it doesn't, I keep working on it. And it's kind of, the best way to describe it as a unified field theory of innovation. So it's looking at the social processes, the structures, the conditions that lead groups, social milieus, to innovate. And before I get into the slides, I just want to make a few points. First of all, the archetypal figure of all creation is the lone creator in the garret, in the studio, off by themselves in the lab. That is the iconic figure of creation. What I found was that, in fact, is not true at all. You never innovate by yourself. You're part of a social milieu. The greater society may look at what you're doing and cast doubt on it, but it doesn't matter if you're, a Pablo Picasso or a Bob Dylan or a John Bardeen, who was part of the team that created the transistor. You're in an environment that is supportive and nurturing and provides you with the tools and the ideas and the feedback to help you figure out that next step. And so as I looked at that, it's like, well, what are those environments like? So that's kind of where I went, and I'll end up talking some about sort of the characteristics of those kind of environments. A couple other things I want to briefly mention. One is that I see innovation as a subset of adaptation. And I see adaptation both in social adaptation and biological adaptation, that we are in an environment that constantly changes. I mean, I come down North Capitol Street a lot. I live in Tacoma Park. So this is a route I do a lot. Today was different. Every day is different on North Capitol Street. I have to decide, do I turn in at H and go over to 3rd? Do I go here? Do I go there? So all of us every day are adapting. We're having to adapt to an environment that shifts and changes on us and that we misfit into. And we're trying to find a better way to fit. And so I see innovation, and I'll define what innovation is, as a subset of adaptation. And so if you think of social adaptation and biological adaptation and the processes involved in that, you're really looking at innovation. I think innovation is kind of nature's gift to us, to be able to solve social problems and to create tools to help us live better together. I think the final thing is adaptation and innovation happen all the time. They happen intentionally in formal settings, but they also happen serendipitously in informal settings. They happen in organizations. They happen in small groups. They happen just with you trying to figure out how to get to work. The thing, though, about in writing about it is I intentionally focused on intentional innovations in formal settings, mostly making things. And the only reason for that is because those are documented, and you can find books and articles to read about them. I think it's just as interesting to look at how we adapt socially and all the little tweaks we do to our environment, but it's harder to get systematic knowledge about that. So even though this is very kind of thing-focused, it really applies to all aspects of our lives and our social world. So, next slide. Actually, it says definitions, and then you can go to the next one. So before I get into the main piece, let me do some definitions first, because I talk about innovation in social milieus, and I think it's important to define what is innovation and what's a social milieu. This is my definition, although I'm borrowing from the dictionary definition of innovation. So there's really sort of four elements. It's a concept embedded within a creation process or social structure that offers something new, unique, and beneficial to a specific context that others can apply to their creations and contexts. So first of all, it's a concept. So if you go to the next slide. So the concept. What is an airplane? So you have the Wright brothers up in the top left corner, and all the way down in the bottom right you have an Airbus. Those are all airplanes. They're all very different. There's almost no similarity between the Wright brothers airplane and the Airbus. None of the materials, none of the technologies, nothing is the same except for the fact that they contain the concept of what Plato would call planeness, airplaneness. They have this concept of an airplane, which is a powered flying vehicle with fixed wings and a weight greater than that of the air it displaces. And so the innovation is a concept, it's not a thing. And the innovative concept can transform and move into different environments. The other elements of, in looking at the definition, is that it offers something new, unique, and beneficial. And newness is really important because I make a really clear distinction between innovation and adaptation. For me, the Wright brothers airplane was the innovation. And everything after that was an adaptation of the concept of airplaneness. However, to move from the Wright brothers to the biplane, to the monoplane, to the jet engine, to the Airbus, tremendous numbers of other kinds of innovations were needed in different kinds of technologies, different materials, and once you get to the Airbus, now these things are almost flying themselves. They have predominantly digital technology. So even though the Wright brothers created the concept of, they took the concept of an airplane and made it into something first, others were trying to do it, they managed to get there before everyone else did. To get to the Airbus, you had to do a lot more than what the Wright brothers did. So the idea of adaptation of something new and unique is important because this is where it began, and then it's going to move. Innovative objects can be around, the innovative concept can be around for thousands of years and be continually modified. Chairs have been around with us at least 5,000 or 6,000 years, if not more, in terms of shapes like this. But the modifications and changes we brought to chairs is dramatic. If you go to the next slide, what this shows is that the act of creation leads to prototyping and commercializing, and then once it's out into the environment, then it gets adapted and goes through this process. Most of the work that is done under the rubric of innovation is really adaptation and moving through this cycle where, you know, you have this chair and this chair works fine, but you need a different kind of chair when you sit at your desk. This chair would be a lousy desk chair because it just doesn't sit in the right angle, the materials, and etc. So a lot of work that happens is really not in coming up with that initial creation, but in coming up with the adaptations to make it useful. And that's really important, and I think a lot of people want to say, I do innovations, and if you say you don't do innovations, they feel like they're being disrespected. In some ways, the adaptation process is more important because it's what makes something useful. What if we only had the Wright brothers airplane still? Well, where would we be? We wouldn't be doing the work we're doing, we'd be tethered to the earth and still getting around with trains. So the fact that people didn't come up with a different type of flight, but took what was existing and changed it was still dramatic that happened. So if you don't feel like you're doing innovation, you're just adapting, don't feel bad. That's what we do. In fact, Thomas Edison, the great inventor, invented only one unique invention in his entire life, and that was the phonograph. Everything else he bought patents for and modified and made better. So even the great inventor was really not the great inventor, he was the great modifier. And that's still fine. So anyway, so that's definitions, and I just have a picture, that's Les Paul. The picture of the guy in the bottom that's Les Paul. That's just to show you what a creation is versus a prototype. Well, prototype. That's the original solid body guitar. I just put that picture in to show you that sometimes the original concept can be pretty crude and rough and not looking like anything that we end up using. So he actually took a railroad tie, cut it, took apart an Epiphone jazz guitar and stuck the neck to it, put a pickup, and he made a solid body guitar. Now his Les Paul guitar that you all Jimmy Page running around on stage with looks far different than that, but conceptually that's the guitar, that's the solid body guitar. So next slide. So now social milieu, let me try and convey this. This is a little, I kind of think of the social milieu as like smoke. You can see it and smell it and touch it, but if you try and grab it, it just kind of poofs away. And social milieu is and this definition is experiential proximate network of people, groups, and organizations facilitating conditions for one to achieve a set of ongoing activities and outputs. If you go to the next slide, that it'll make maybe hopefully a little more sense. The difference between a social milieu and, say, the state of Maryland or the District of Columbia is that a social milieu is a self-constructed reality. People get together and it kind of emerges out of the social world setting. People come together in order to do certain things to achieve certain outputs. So Fantasy League Baseball is a social milieu. It's self-constructed. Somebody at some point said, guess what, we could do this, this is fun. And so, so that came to be. A lot of innovation locations, spaces, are social milieus. You don't know they're there unless you're a part of it. Now we know Silicon Valley's there only because of an article in the newspaper back in the 70s that said, hey, there's this place called Silicon Valley, and that's where all the tech firms are. But Silicon Valley had actually been there since 1910. It began as a tech center in 1910, but nobody thought of it that way. Same thing with, you know, whether it was the Village in New York City and the folk scene in the 50s and 60s, the media discovered it before then. It was this kind of amorphous thing where people came in and got together. So it's a self-constructed reality, it's experientially proximate. In other words, we're not necessarily geographically together, but we are together through experience and we can affect one another. And it may be nested in, but it also may straddle across formal organizations. So our self-constructed reality is the development community. Nobody said you guys form as an organization and other organizations will form and you will do this. It's people said something needs to be done, so they came in together and we have this development community. We're nested here in the District of Columbia, but SAVE is also straddling across lots of geographies. We're not bounded by the political division, the political geography or the other kinds of formal geographies. So social milieus are where these things happen, and a lot of the reason for the term emergence, where this technology emerges and we didn't see it coming, is because you can't see where things are being made. Only the people making them know they're being made, and until they go through that process and out into the broader environment, only then do you know that thing happened. And so that, you know, the PC came about in 1974, but it was a hobby kit. And it wasn't until 77, 78, Radio Shack put out the TRS-80 that people said, oh, that's interesting. But there were a whole community of people that were working on the concept of a PC going back to the late 60s, early 70s. So suddenly emergence is actually, as us finally seeing something that's actually been around for a while in one of these sort of hidden social milieus. And next slide. So what I'd like to do is try and particularize, make this a little more concrete. I hope it'll still be a little abstract, but I'll try and make it concrete and then make it really concrete so we can sort of look at it and talk about it. And so what I'm going to do is, like I said, there's lots of directions I've went in the paper, but I'm going to focus down on specific social milieus and the characteristics of them. So if you go to the next slide, this is you know, I look at it and I understand what it's saying, but it is kind of busy when you look at it to begin with. But one way to think of what makes a space innovative, or the other term I use is operational, and I use these as kind of dichotomies. There's innovation spaces and there's operational spaces. We, I, you, about everybody we know lives in an operational space. In other words, we have things that we need to do, we have requirements placed on us, we have things to produce, clients want stuff, programs need overseeing, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's an operational space and there's an innovation space. And how do those two come about? The best way I found to describe these spaces is to look at not the organization, but look at the people coming into the organization. And how do people come in, and then what is required of them once they're inside the organization? And so if you look across the top, it says entrance requirements. All social groups have entrance requirements. If you're a clique in high school, there's certain social things you have to meet to be allowed into that clique. If you're a fraternity, if you're a sports team, if you're a workplace, you have requirements. In our world, we have very formal requirements. We put an ad out, we put requisitions out. People send in resumes, we look at them, we talk to them, we say, you must have the following criteria, this degree, these many years experience, etc. So every organization only allows people in who meet the requirements of that organization. And even if it's an informal social organization, there's something that says you belong or don't belong. So you can think of entrance requirements as being on two poles. One is lenient and one is prescriptive. Lenient is kind of like, come on down, any and everyone. A good example of that is the military in time of war. Unless you got flat feet or a heart murmur or something like that, we'll take you. We'll figure out what to do with you after you're in. Public schools, any kid's allowed in. So you come in, it's any and everyone. So the other side is prescriptive, and that's where we live. We live in a prescriptive world. You have to meet some very stringent requirements in a lot of work settings to be able to allow into that work setting and be an employee. And so you have these two different things on entrance requirements. Once you're inside the organization, you have performance requirements. And performance requirements are what that says. What do I have to do to be allowed to continue to work here? You know? So you can't just come in and surf the internet. You got to do something. And two ways to look at it are criterion-based, and then the other is outcome-based. And criterion-based is along the way, we are going to have requirements, like you need to show up at a certain time, spend so much time here. These are your job duties. You know, if you're a data analyst, you need to apply those skills to the problems we put in front of you, and you need to do it at a certain quality level. Some jobs require you to do a certain volume of work. But whatever it is, criterion-based place criteria on you, and you have to meet those criteria. And if you don't, then it's questionable whether they'll allow you to stay in. Outcome-based is exactly that. It's not what you do here, it's what you produce that matters. So think of, probably one of the more extreme versions is the dissolute rock band. So they show up in the studio and they're all kind of messed up, and the company will pay for them to do another record. If you have another band shows up and they're like diligent and they're there and they're great, they're competent on their instruments, they're totally sober, they do everything the producer and engineer wants, and the record's a dud, that's it, they're done. So, and that's sort of the extreme version. So outcome-based is really saying, what are you producing? What did you do for me? I don't care how you did it, just do something really great based on what that environment looks for. And as you can see, you have innovation spaces are very much outcome-based. And the issue is, what are you producing, not how are you doing it, and did you do this 6 times this week? And so they get, as you can see, it's the classic, I always like to say the classic Boston Consulting Group 2x2 matrix. They were a firm that created this 2x2 matrix we've all been using for the last 40, 50 years. Oh, okay. And so the thing about innovation spaces is that they do break down based on lenient and prescriptive. And sort of the rock band is an example of a lenient. I had a friend who in the 70s got interested in PCs. He had no training. He just taught himself how to do it, opened up a little firm, and for 35 years he ran a computer consulting firm. Because at that time, that world had no rules and had no training and had nothing. So you have this lenient. Prescriptive really are what we think of as like laboratories, where, like at NIH, where there may only be a handful of people qualified to run that lab, but once they're in that lab, that's not what you do every day, it's are you moving towards some kind of interesting, useful research outcome. So these are two very different kinds of environments. I think a really important point, I know I'm sort of rambling on here, but a really important point about these environments, operational versus innovation, and this is the real challenge, is they cannot happen in the same space. They cannot be coincident. They can be contiguous, but they can't be coincident. I think that's the challenge we face as we try and build innovation into our day-to-day practices, is the operational demands always pull us away from trying to do something interesting because you're not sure what you need to do next, and you need time to figure that out. But there are some ways to address this. So if you go to the next slide, I'll show you some, these are some examples of innovation spaces. The one on the far left is the discrete laboratory, and this is, as I said, totally dedicated. Examples are, places like Bell Labs, Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, DARPA, places that are completely dedicated. The kind of the hybrid is what you see in a lot of corporations, which is a corporate design center. So all the automobile companies in the world have corporate design centers. Apple has development centers. Not everybody at Apple creates stuff, only their design centers create stuff. They still have production, marketing, etc. And so what they're doing is they're recognizing that these are discrete environments, but they're putting them, and they're giving them their own space to operate in, and they're sitting contiguous to the rest of the company. Ford has to come out with new cars every year. To do that, you need engineers and designers working diligently every day on new designs. But they can't do it if they're stuck in a factory. They have to be separated out and operating in a contiguous fashion with the organization. The other way, and this is I think the way we try and deal with it, is I'll just use the broad term communities of practice, where we try and give people a certain amount of time in the week or the month to come together with other people dealing with these issues, and to try and come up with innovations that get embedded into our day-to-day work. And I think being in an operational environment, it's challenging, and what makes it really challenging and why there are people in this organization dedicated to innovation is so many new things are happening that we have to keep scanning the horizon to figure out what's going to be the new practice that we want to embed into our ongoing work. And so if you go to the next slide, and what's important is these are discrete, these environments are serving different purposes. And so discrete laboratories are almost always in the public sector because they're often high dollar investments, and you need things like government funds and big foundation money to do this because they're doing highly prospective work that has a low probability of return. There are a lot of failures in these kind of labs. That's okay as long as you learn from them and get better the next time. And so I won't get it anyway. There's a whole thing about some congressmen are saying, why do we need NIH? This is why you need NIH, because they do things that the private sector can't afford to do. What the private sector is doing is they're looking at a lot of different innovations. They rarely innovate. They're actually doing a really great job of adapting innovations into their settings. And what they're doing is they're looking at moderate to high probability of success innovations. And they're really smart at figuring out what has a chance of succeeding and what doesn't, and not wasting too much time with the former. So they also serve a purpose. They're not substitutes for one another. And then what we're trying to do in our settings with these community of practices is we're not trying to build a new car. We're not saying we're going to completely redesign how everything we do. We're looking at how to refresh and improve the work that we're doing. So having a little more of a smaller focus, not having a huge design center, a Save the Children Design Center, which would be fun. That's why we're not doing that, is because we're really trying to refresh the work that we're doing, not completely redo it like Ford's going to put out an entirely new model. We're trying to simply refresh, and so hopefully it can serve that purpose. What I want to do is talk about the nature of inside these innovation spaces. What's it like? what kind of goes on, some of the characteristics of them. I mean, first of all, this is the organizational hierarchy. So you have senior management, you have middle management, you have the operations side of folks, the folks who are doing the work, you know, the people who are actually doing something. And so what I did was I put a red box around the operations and also the bottom tier of the middle management, because those are the middle managers who are managing the operations group. So if you take the team that created the transistor at Bell Labs in 1948, you had the 3 lead scientists who got the Nobel Prize for that were Brattain, Bardeen, and Shockley. And then there were another 8 or 9 engineers and scientists on that team. So they were they were at Bell Labs, which was a big R&D center for the telephone company, the National Telephone Company at the time. And they were part of a team that was embedded in that. Shockley was the manager of it, and he managed the team, so he was actually up in the next box, but everybody else was in the operations space for the innovation. So that was the innovation team, and Shockley was, since this was really important to Bell Labs that they create a transistor and they get there first, Mervyn Kelly, who was the president of Bell Labs, would talk directly to Shockley. So this is where you find innovation. Senior management, I've been in senior management, we don't innovate. We don't have time, that's not our role. That's not the role in the organization, it's to guide. It's the people that are innovating are you. You're the ones that are seeing what's happening, you're seeing the new ideas, you're putting them into practice. So if you go to the next one, we can drill down a little bit, sort of some of the characteristics that occur in these innovation spaces is, I'll just say, just like Shockley and Mervyn, Shockley talked directly to Mervyn Kelly, he didn't go through the layers that were above him. There's often, what does that say? Shortened distance. There's a shortened distance, and the other thing that happens usually between key innovation activities and senior management is there's a lack of attenuation of information. We attenuate information as it goes up. In other words, your boss sees a lot of information, your boss's boss gets a boiled down version. By the time it gets to the head of the organization, they're seeing like one number, you know. So there's a shortened distance and a lack of attenuation. But the other 2 things that are really interesting and important is interdisciplinary teams. Los Alamos, where they created the atom bomb, was the first example of a research organization using interdisciplinary teams. It was just by chance. Some groups decided they were going to work that way. Instead of having the physicists do one thing, the chemists do another, the engineers do another, they all just worked together. And what they found was they got to solutions much, much faster. And just by chance, Mervyn Kelly, president of Bell Labs was shuttered during World War II, and all the scientists and engineers went out and worked on the war effort. He was assigned to Los Alamos, and he saw this, he came back, and he created interdisciplinary teams. The team that created the transistor was an interdisciplinary team. There were 3 other teams at other companies and organizations trying to create the transistor at the same time, and they beat them to it. Partly because they were working in this sort of much more efficient fashion. The other thing that has cropped up since then is the idea of open space. And literally, both physically and socially, the space is completely open. The previous slide that had the middle thing with all the desks and stuff, that's the Ford Design Center. There are no walls, there's no cubes, there's nothing. They work in a big, huge open space. And I'm not sure where it started, but the first time I read about it was Lee Iacocca in the 80s designed the new Chrysler Design Center was based around interdisciplinary teams and open space. He wanted people to lean over and go, what are you working on? He wanted people to interrupt other people. He wanted to see that happen. He knew that's how you learn and how you accelerated learning. And so open space and interdisciplinary teams are really key. Silicon Valley talks a lot about this, and they sort of talk about it as if they created it, but they didn't. They're just copying what's been people have been doing for a while now. But anyway, so those are 2 characteristics, and I think I just have one more slide. I'll just quickly do that. And then what I'm just end with this. It's just it's like balloons. Each one of those circles is, just imagine it an innovation organization, and so imagine that's, say, Silicon Valley or some other place. There's some characteristics that really separate innovation spaces, broad innovation spaces from others. And first of all, as you see over on the right, it says agglomerative. That's a word, if you don't know, you should learn it. It's fun to use on your friends. Agglomeration, the best example of agglomeration is a restaurant district. You go and there's lots of restaurants. They agglomerate. They're agglomerating. So people study agglomeration. What it is that even though neoclassical economic theory says that businesses are in competition with each other, they're actually cooperating with each other a lot too. And so you go to a restaurant district because you're not sure which restaurants you want to go to. So if you locate your restaurant way far away, nobody's going to come to you unless you're really good. So that's the reason you agglomerate. You share resources, you share customers, you share staff, move back and forth around the restaurant. So even though we have digital technologies and people can work remotely, what even studies in the last 5 years have found is that innovation clusters still are agglomerating. And they're finding that if you're more than 3 miles away from the other people, you're losing out on the knowledge exchange that happens inside these. Some of the other characteristics are small world networks. Small world networks are where everybody's kind of connected to everybody, as opposed to you're in charge and you'll tell everybody when something's going to happen. No, we're all talking to each other all the time, and they're very dense, very dense. It's not just they're connected, there's lots of connections and a lot of interactions. So they're dense, small world networks. The other thing is, I don't find this in network theory, and it should be somewhere, but networks are three-dimensional, but they always get displayed like this in two. So if you take this and imagine their organization, but then you rotate it around 90 degrees, so you're looking at it this way, it's that hierarchy, right? The organizational hierarchy. Here's the senior management, middle, and bottom. What they find in these kind of spaces is that it's not just like the middle managers talking or the CEOs talking to each other. Everybody talks to everybody. And so the engineer who's 1 year out of undergraduate school is getting to know engineers at other firms and talking. And the phrase somebody used in one of the articles was, their loyalty is more to the idea than to the company. And they're more interested in where things are going and being where that's happening. And if this company serves that purpose, I'll stay. If it doesn't, I'm out of here. And so that's a really key thing. And then the final thing is, I actually got rid of, I put structural holes in there. There's a whole body of literature in network theory around ties between different clusters of groups and people and what the effect is. And one of the things that happens in any kind of network is you have what they call structural holes. In other words, there's no connection between these two organizations. One solution to that is what is called brokers. It's having people who serve a broker's role. And brokers in these kind of settings are incredibly important. So it's 1920 and you're in Montmartre, you can say it better than me, Montmartre, Paris, where all the artists are up on the hill. You're what, Sacré-Cœur? The cathedral sitting up there, and all the artists are there because the rents are cheap. And so what happens is all these dealers come snooping around to see what people are doing. They're literally brokers, but they're serving this broker role. They're going to connect these artists with clients. And there's some of these dealers don't have galleries, but they're going to get a commission for connecting them to a really well-known gallery down on the Champs-Élysées. So that's what the brokers. In Silicon Valley, believe it or not, the brokers tend to be venture capitalists and lawyers. And it was surprising when they discovered that lawyers were serving the broker role, because they thought lawyers would sit back and wait for the firms to come to them. But they realize that the law is changing quickly, these firms are changing quickly, and to serve their clients, they have to know, too, technically what's going on. And so these law firms are doing the same thing venture capital firms are. They're going out and getting to know everybody and seeing what's happening. And they're not just saying, I'll give you legal advice, they'll help connect people with each other. And so these broker roles are really important in these kind of environments. So that's about it, I think.
So we have a little bit of time left for a question. Thank you, Don. This is fantastically interesting. For me, as part of the innovation team, it's interesting to see the parts that maybe we have or we need to strengthen. So any questions or commentary based on the presentation here? In the room or like it?
I just missed the introduction, so apologies for coming late, but I'm quite curious as to how we, Save the Children, connected with you, the speaker, and how much of our organization has been exposed to some of these kinds of ideas, because I'm already thinking of people that should see this or would benefit from seeing this.
So maybe we can have an after the presentation discussion about that, and we're videoing it, so we're not going to lose it.
So Eric and I worked together at ICF before he came here.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
we were partners in crime.
Focus.
Yeah, and we talked across level. He was a senior VP, I was a Sherpa. But we need to continue this discussion. Other question or commentary? Yes, please.
Thank you, that was really interesting. I'm wondering, this is probably a huge can of worms, but how do you apply this to work in the development community, social media development, and the fact that typically we're not structured by Silicon Valley?
Yeah, it's funny.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, can you repeat the question?
The question was how can this apply to the development community, or and I assume the work we're doing out in the field. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure the extent to which this particular slice, but the paper covers I call it the supply chain of innovation, all the way from raw materials to how it completely can change society. So I talk about that. The other piece that, and some of this came out of, is the underlying foundational piece is self-organizing systems. I got very first interested in self-organizing systems because I was watching people do the same thing in different places. I'm like, why is this happening? What are the principles that lead people to do this? So I got interested in self-organizing systems, and in particular, what I found very frustrating is self-organizing actually comes out of thermodynamics, and it explains equilibrium states, which I actually have the book, and I can read about the introduction, and that's about it. It gets into lots of formulas. But it's been applied into lots of different settings, and when I got picked up a few things, this is going back 12, 14 years, picked up a few things on social applications. I wasn't happy with it. It didn't really tell me much. So the bulk of the time I spent for a few years was trying to figure out how do you see self-organizing in a social setting? What does it look like? When they say autocatalysis, what is autocatalysis? And that slide with the entrance requirements and performance, that it was my way of explaining autocatalysis. Autocatalysis is how do you bring new members into the situation. So I actually was thinking of a title for a paper called Self-Organizing and Sustainability, Why Development Works and Doesn't Work.
I've copyrighted that, you can't do it.
But I think if you were to look at some of the other things in there, it could help us a lot, because what self-organizing does, it looks at the resources available, it looks at the people, it looks at what's called mutual causality, which is the ability to affect one another, and how that's regulated and managed. And then it looks at what's called disequilibrium, which is how much order and chaos there is in a system. And when I look at a lot of these countries, one of the things you see resource gaps. So you can have in fact, one of the things that's really interesting is with sort of some of these ideas of the social milieu and innovation is, it doesn't say you need smart people. You already have smart people. It says they need a place to be able to do that. Every society has its Picassos and Einsteins. But do they have a place where they can live out that? And that's kind of what we're trying to do in our work, is give people the opportunity to live out their lives to the fullest. And so sometimes it's resource gaps, autocatalysis. If you think about, are there the right members for this organization? And that's, development's been doing education programs for years and years. So I think in looking at some of those elements, you can kind of see maybe where the developing, where some of these countries the focal point should be. Sometimes they already have something and we're giving them too much of something and they need something different. Anyway, I'm not sure that answers your question, but I think in the paper there are some things I'm sort of interested in trying to do something with that.
Can we share the paper? Or
Yeah.
Oh, we can share the paper. So we'll be happy to share Don's paper and a little bit of self-promotion. But there's a reason we connected. Last year I presented a paper at a conference that's also available, and it's called Self-Organizing or Self-Organization in Global Health and Blind Spots to Self-Organization, why we have trouble seeing it. So it relates a little bit to these network processes.
Yeah.
In some of our projects, we provide innovation grants, and we have competitive processes to award for innovations. So what would your recommendations be to make sure we get as much as possible out of those? We typically don't fund spaces for people to work in. We may give them resources for experimentation or a grant to follow through on an idea.
I'm not sure I have an answer right off the bat. Based on some of the stuff, I think it's not just the idea, but the organization, and is the organization set up to be able to do that, to succeed in that way. Yeah, it'd be kind of interesting to take a look at that and to see if there's some ways to tweak it, if there's ways that could improve. What kind of success have you had with the innovation grants?
Well, I'm very new to Save the Children, but in USAID, for example, where I worked before, we've had, grand challenges for coming up with ideas for newborn health, for example, and so on. And there's a lot of success for good ideas. I don't know how many of them are actually sustained. But I'm thinking if we had innovation grants program for developing, agricultural implements, for, let's say, for women, would it make sense to actually promote people who want to work on these innovative approaches, for them to work in one space, and for the innovation grant to fund a space where they could all work together?
Possibly. I think the other thing that sometimes seems to lack is just the information exchanges among like-minded people. So like if you're doing, say in food security, you have dry rice farming happening in different parts of the world, are they able to actually exchange? Sometimes I think we take it upon ourselves to be the ones to disseminate.
Yes.
And I kind of think one of the things that innovation could do would be to allow the beneficiaries to connect with each other, and if somebody's had a real success with a particular technique, to then have a way for them to communicate that and spread that around. Because in some ways, I would bet a farmer is a little more trusting of another farmer than an aid worker. Because a farmer has to put their family's welfare on the line when they try something new. We're just showing up to say, hey, this is great. And so, yeah, I kind of think sometimes it's the exchanges at the beneficiary level that might really kind of produce some interesting results. So.
I really like the connection that you made between innovation versus adaptation. I'm trying to think how I can word my question, but in general, I think there are a lot of people making adaptations and not necessarily innovations. But a lot of times, I think if you're making an adaptation, you're trying to advertise it as an innovation for like copyright reasons, or for, if you have an adaptation, how do you kind of protect yourself in general? Does it kind of depend on the organization? I'll give you kind of an example. So there's a research methodology that I'd like to use that was developed by another organization. I'd like to adapt that. I have an idea of an adaptation, but I have to be careful because I didn't create the innovation, but I have an adaptation. So right now I'm trying to figure out, what can I do? Really, I need to talk,
Yeah.
It's sensitive, and I feel like that happens a lot in development work. We're all in this to help people, but there's still competition, for funding, and I feel like And maybe this is also a question for the innovations team here.
Yeah, because I don't know within whatever you're trying to do, what the standard understanding is as to when something is copied and something's new,
Yeah.
you know? Because isn't it with patents, you have to introduce something new into the, so like, if you propose a motorized surfboard and nobody's ever had a motorized surfboard, the motor makes it new, right?
Mhm.
So, in patent law, I think that's kind of the base thing, but I'm not sure within your setting, the tweak you're gonna do that makes it a bit different enough that they would be considered.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think in our field, if you're talking about research methodology, be hard pressed to really think about a research methodology that's patented. Maybe you have tools, like if we want to use the DHS software or whatever that monster is, maybe that's, we would have to bargain with Don, but if you want to do a survey, you can read about how ICF does the DHS, and if you know how to do it, it's survey methodology. I don't think it's patented. So, and in our field, it seems to me like there's more brands than really types of research methodologies, because I think it's a bit cultural. We like to rebrand every time we change something. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I know in commercial market research, I used to work in that some in the 90s. Little research firms would come up with their unique analytic method, where they do something visual with how they were presenting, and it would be their own unique thing. But I don't think they had a patent or a copyright on those kinds of things.
I think it gets, for our work, oftentimes where copyright issues are brought up and whether official copyright needs to be established or not. And then when you develop a tool or a methodology within one program and adapt it for the future, we've seen examples of other organizations kind of taking over, and even in the discussions around crediting, it gets complicated. So I don't think there is an easy answer for this.
And anything that's been developed with US government money, for example, USAID, that's public domain. So for example, there's a RCT that came out today about CARE's community scorecard work. It's excellent work, really from an evaluation and from a perspective. I still haven't run into anybody at CARE or Save the Children that can explain to me the difference between the community scorecard and the PDQ approach, which is our approach. And that includes people from Save the Children, which we had on video on this screen, to explain how it worked in Malawi. I don't know. If there's a difference, I'm not smart enough to pick it up.
If we have a question about something like what I'm talking about, could I come to one of you to see if it's...
Jean, stand up.
Okay.
Jean is a real innovation champion, and I'm like, I don't know, what am I, a spokesperson or something?
A decider.
So don't hesitate. We actually have some level of effort that is paid to talk to you about stuff like this.
Okay.
Not that we would otherwise we would have. Just kidding.
We'll charge you.
We'll charge you. No, we're totally open and here to help any innovation idea.
Okay, great.
Do you have any suggestions on how to make happen some of the things that you had in there? For example, a shorter distance between the muckety mucks and the worker bees, and how to create more of a multidisciplinary group. Any suggestions on the operationalization of that? Of innovation?
Make more multidisciplinary groups.
Oh, okay.
No, yeah, I actually had a title for the paper called Engineering Innovation, and then I realized I didn't know how to engineer innovation, so I dropped the title. I thought it would be bad title. It was a great title. People loved it. It was like, oh, that's great. Yeah, what does that mean? Like, I can describe. I find it really hard. I hate to say it this way. I find it really hard because I've run. I don't know if you were at Macro during the Big Idea thing. I oversaw a corporate Big Idea competition. I ran 4 community practices corporately. I've done similar things in the last year and a half for really large bids where I've had to pull people together. And I find the challenge is the operational work is like the gravity pulling you back to earth. And that's, I think, what we need to figure out in our environment is how to counteract that gravity somewhat, because you get 8 people together for the initial meeting, and then 3 of them travel, and the other 2 have deliverables, and you had great ideas, and they want to do it, and they want to be engaged. But it's really hard to keep the momentum going. I think that's the biggest challenge, like with communities of practice, is keeping the momentum going. In some ways, I almost feel like the organization has to sanction it and give permission and give that space to make it happen in some way. I mean, I don't know how you guys talk. We talk in terms of utilization, billability. So, you know, there's challenges in the operational environment, which is why people like Ford created these discrete design centers where that's all you did.
Question, how many people have heard either Jean, myself, or Kim Coletti speak about the innovation process here at SAVE? So, most people have heard about it, okay. We have 30 seconds for last question. All right, that's really
You mentioned that lab-type offices are good for innovations. And what are your recommendations for offices that are not lab-type? And also...
You mean open?
Yeah, open space, yeah. I'm also curious to hear our team's feedback, like about how you see being more innovative in a space like Save the Children with just small cubicles.
I think, you know, I've had the chance to work in interdisciplinary settings, and it's actually a lot of fun. Years ago, I used to work, believe it or not, I worked for Pepco, the utility, which is down the street from here. And I was in strategic planning, which actually introduced me to a lot of interesting things. But I was working in interdisciplinary teams where we had to suddenly design $500 million worth of energy efficiency programs. So I worked with an engineer, a lawyer, economists, MBA, and I was the market analysis guy. So it was really great working in those teams. And so I think the more you can sort of mix it up like that in your projects, and one of the things that can happen is when you mix up your projects like that and you're a little more interdisciplinary, you get to know other perspectives, and I think that actually facilitates some innovative thinking in and of itself. Because what happens often is the evaluators hang out with the evaluators and the monitoring people with the monitoring and the field people here, and you don't really, or you're not picking up new ideas. And really that's one way within an organization, I think, is to structure things in an interdisciplinary way. And I've had a chance to do that and to be a part of it, and it really gives you a different way of looking at things.
So thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks to Don again for giving a lot of wisdom. Thanks to Jean for organizing all this. Thanks to Aaron and Megan and everybody who's helped, the tech guys. Don is going to be here. We've got a couple of meetings this afternoon, so if you want to hang out, ask more questions, you're very welcome to it. But see you at the next Innovation Brown Bag.